After the runaway success of the first 3 Final Fantasy games in Japan, plans are made to bring them to the US market in 1990, but Square gets some help.
Actually, Square didn't bring the first Final Fantasy game to the US. It was brought over by Nintendo themselves. Part of the reason the delay is that at the time, Square didn't have a very large US presence. So the resources necessary for translating a large text-heavy RPG was probably beyond that company.
Nintendo's help with the translation and a promotional push with their Nintendo Power magazine helps the game find a new audience.
The Nintendo Propaganda magazine had huge 8-10-page spreads on it every month for 6 months, and I read them and I couldn't believe what I was reading. This game wasn't like other games. I went nuts. My friends went nuts. We could just tell that this game was something special, that it was more to it than other games. That it was a world. Maybe not the most complicated world, but at the time there was nothing like it. That year when I made a Christmas list to give to my parents, it had one item on it, and that was Final Fantasy. That was the only thing I wanted.
Word begins to spread, and Squaresoft's Swan Song becomes a hit all over again.
It's kind of a common misconception that Final Fantasy I didn't sell well in America, but actually it was quite popular.
But the video game world is changing, and a leap forward in technology leaves the 2 sequels by the wayside.
Final Fantasy I came out in the US after Final Fantasy III was released in Japan in 1990. By that point, Nintendo had kind of closed the book on the Nintendo Entertainment System and was really gearing up for the Super Nintendo launch.
Square begins work on the sequel, but changing technology requires a Final Fantasy facelift. On July 19, 1991, Square releases the 4th Final Fantasy game in Japan, which arrives in the US several months later as Final Fantasy II. The popularity of the Final Fantasy series plays an important part in the launch of Nintendo's new system.
Final Fantasy fans are notoriously devoted to their series. When their favorite series made the jump to Nintendo's new hardware, they did too. Square and Nintendo's relationship went both ways. Nintendo's popular hardware helped Square sell lots of copies of Final Fantasy games, but in turn, the popularity of Square's Final Fantasy games drove players to choose Nintendo's hardware. Nintendo probably saw that Final Fantasy was a key franchise they had that would set their system apart from others, and because of that, they latched onto it and promoted it to give them an edge above their competitors.
On December 6, 1992, Square releases Final Fantasy V in Japan. The game is considered too hard for American gamers and isn't released in the US. But fans would not have to wait long. The 6th game in the series arrives in Japanese stores on April 2, 1994. The game arrives in America as Final Fantasy III, and it once again takes the video game world by storm.
Final Fantasy VI was a graphical powerhouse. It was the most beautiful game you'd ever seen. I think it was the first game in which Yoshitaka Amano's art was able to be preserved in the characters and in the world, not just in the monster designs. Graphic technology had improved to the point where small bits and pieces of his style were able to show through. It had a fantastic musical score. The music is widely considered to be Nobuo Uematsu's best score.
For their next game, Square lays the foundation for a game unlike any other. But their path will take them away from the company that had first helped them become a success.
As a software provider of great content and games, to meet consumer demand, it requires a lot of investments and time. For Final Fantasy VI, we expanded, we opened some doors. And in order to keep on doing that with the next installment, we as a development team wanted to obviously make it visually more advanced. And I think it was only going to work for us if we went with the hardware that had more capacity for us.
After Final Fantasy VI came out, everyone assumed that Square would move on to the Nintendo 64. In fact, Square released a graphical demo using the Final Fantasy VI characters. This graphical test was preparation for developing Final Fantasy VII. When Square did announce Final Fantasy VII, it wasn't for the Nintendo 64. It was for the Sony PlayStation.
We saw that the PlayStation was going to be better for us with its higher performance.
Square stuns the game world and strikes an unexpected alliance with Sony.
I do remember that one day, Sakaguchi-san and I just bumped in the hallway, and he was wearing something on top that already had the PlayStation logo on it, basically, and said, "This is what we are going for." And so I just said, "Okay, that's fine." And that was pretty much it.
A new game is planned, one that will finally achieve the movie-like game quality the previous incarnations have been building towards.
PlayStation っていうハードに
The big leap came with Final Fantasy VII. That was when the company switched to the PlayStation game console. With the enhanced capabilities of the console, I now had 3D graphics as a method of expression. I now had the use of camera moves and was able to show visuals from different angles. I was able to really expand my visual expressions and create a much more intricate storyline, as well as intricate visuals for the game.
When creating 7, we were just so sucked into creating the game that it didn't feel as long as the development period as I thought. Seeing things that we had never seen before done in the sense of creating movies.
Character designer Tetsuya Nomura is called upon to bring his 3D fantasy to life.
I was in charge of the character design for Final Fantasy VII. This was the one Final Fantasy to date that I've been most deeply involved in. It was the first 3D game going on the PlayStation. I also saw how the monsters and characters and all those things worked out. So I kind of oversaw a balance of all those elements. It was something that the team was so excited about what we were doing that it just didn't seem like we were spending so much time on it. We also felt as if we were creating the next generation role-playing game, like we were all leading the way and we were all creating something. We were pioneering this genre over again. I think the final product was very close to what we had envisioned and what our goal was.
Final Fantasy VII is released in both the US and Japan as a PlayStation exclusive in 1997, and Sony launches a massive worldwide ad campaign, and it pays off.
Traditionally, role-playing games have appealed to about 10 to 15% of the market. You know, very dedicated part of the market, but not huge. And what Final Fantasy VII did was just explode that. Suddenly, everyone wanted to play the game, and role-playing games were no longer kind of this niche thing.
3 million was a goal that we had in mind. And in the US, maybe $1 million. And it did go to $1 million. It went beyond $1 million. So we did feel as if, oh, are we going to really be able to beat these numbers? And when we did, we were excited, but also, at the same time, that it went beyond those numbers. We were very happy that it sold more than we had anticipated or expected.
Work begins on Final Fantasy VIII. Square releases Final Fantasy VIII to an eager crowd of fans in 1999.
When a Final Fantasy game comes out in Japan, it's an event. We talk about Myst being the biggest CD-ROM game of all time. They sold 4 million units in over a 4 or 5 year span. Final Fantasy VIII sold over 3.5 million units in about a month in Japan.
A 9th installment quickly follows, featuring the return of artist Yoshitaka Amano.
As the Final Fantasy series became increasingly cinematic, logically it seemed like the next step was to make a movie.
And that movie put Square in a whole other circle.